And I wanted to welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. My name is Ann Lee, and I am the Programs Associate for CAN-DO Multiple Sclerosis. Thank you for joining us for this webinar this evening titled Disability and Social Security, Understanding a Critical Social Net with Thomas Stewart, Physician Assistant and Attorney. CAN-DO MS is an innovative provider of lifestyle empowerment programs for people living with MS and their support partners. We empower people to move beyond their MS by giving them the knowledge, skills, tools, and confidence to adopt healthy lifestyle behaviors, actively co-manage their disease, and live their best lives.
You can learn about all of our programs by visiting our website at www.mscando.org. You can look for any upcoming webinars and register for those. You can also listen and view our archived webinars, which are recorded webinars for the last 2 years. And you can also learn or register about our in-person programs. We have our flagship CAN-DO program, our one-day Jumpstart programs, and our 2.5-day Take Charge programs. You can also search for us and connect with us on social media. We do have a Facebook page. You can like us on Facebook and find up-to-date information regarding our upcoming programs and events. And you can also share a CAN-DO pledge on our Facebook page, which I will talk more about later at the end of the webinar. We're also on Twitter and on YouTube, where you can find webinar recordings previously recorded. And just a few housekeeping items before we get started. As our operator Patrick had mentioned before, we will have a question and answer portion at the end of the webinar. To ask your questions, you can post your questions to me by typing in the chat feature below that's located on the left bottom side of your computer screen. So you can just submit your questions by typing in there and direct it towards the presenters or the co-chair. This presentation is being recorded, and it will be archived on CAN-DO MS's website. All of our monthly webinars are archived on our website, and you can view them at any time. And you can also view the webinar schedule and register for upcoming events and webinars. Those of you who are on the call this evening, you'll receive an email from me with copies of tonight's PowerPoint presentation in a PDF format. And also, please remember to complete the evaluation at the end of this evening's webinar. We value everyone's feedback. And before I introduce our next speaker, you should see on the screen a polling question for you. So if you could just take a minute and let us know what age range you fall into, and click Submit. That'll give us a good idea of who we have on our call tonight. Excellent. Looks like most of our participants are between the age range of 46 to 59. Thanks so much for answering that. And I'd like to now introduce our presenter for this evening, Thomas M. Stewart. Tom Stewart is a physician assistant who has been treating people with multiple sclerosis for over 10 years. For the past 5 years, he has run a clinic for indigent patients with MS. He's also developed a special interest in complementary and alternative medicine in MS and has published and lectured numerous times on these topics. Mr. Stewart is also an attorney with the national practice specialized in handling Social Security claims for clients living with multiple sclerosis. I'd like to now welcome Mr. Tom Stewart.
Thank you, Ann. So I just want to add to what Ann said. I think she and I were talking a little just beforehand that not only would it be appropriate, and we look forward to questions at the end, but if you have questions as the presentation proceeds, I think it would be fine to ask them as they come up. And if I have a chance and I can manage all the technical features of this presenter, this ReadyTalk, then I will answer the questions. So I want to begin with the sort of the emotional aspect of this, which, you know, I don't think that it's reasonable for, I mean, certainly most people with MS are not going to be applying for disability. Certainly medications are improving. If people are diagnosed early, get on good therapies, I think there's every reason to be hopeful that disability that means an inability to work will never materialize. I think it's good hygiene for most people to understand something about Social Security disability. However, there are many people who are, hopefully this will be relevant to, in part because they're involved in the process, but I think even though many people with MS, and maybe most people with MS, will never become disabled, it's still good to know about. So I work at the Rocky Mountain MS Center in Denver, and I'm privileged to be able to have one-on-one meetings with people here in Colorado to teach them about Social Security. And I thought that before going into my slides, it might be useful to describe what one of those meetings is like, to sort of make it real, because it is a very scary and very critical subject. So I'm going to talk about a typical, but a typical hypothetical person. I'll just call her Anne for purposes of this presentation. And the way I usually get referrals at the Rocky Mountain MS Center is through the physicians or other clinicians, meaning the physician assistants or nurse practitioners. And they are very familiar with my service. And when a patient, one of their patients, expresses some concern about the potential for applying for disability benefits, they're generally referred to me right away. And so it might, for example, and it's usually I think the biggest service I can provide is when people are still working and wrestling with the decision about whether to apply for disability benefits. So let's assume that Anne, in her routine visit with her physician, says, I'm having more and more trouble with work. I'm thinking about applying for Social Security disability benefits, and gets referred to me. Now, in my example, she's still working. So when I'm meeting with Anne, one of the first things first misconceptions I encounter is that many people who are still working think that they can apply for disability, and then if they get it, stop working. That's not the way it works, maybe unfortunately. So one of the first shocks for most people who are still working and thinking about applying for Social Security is that they need to face the reality that they're going to have to quit and take a chance that Social Security will find them disabled. In other words, it's not automatic. It's not just, I think I'm disabled, and then Social Security necessarily agrees. So Anne will have trouble with that, and let's assume further that Anne has no spouse who's working and no significant assets, and that her health insurance is also available to her through her job. And let's assume that she's living more or less paycheck to paycheck. So she's going to say, she's going to have a lot of questions like, when will my benefits begin? How much will I get? What's my probability of success? What am I going to do for insurance? When will I find out? So she has a lot of questions that will come often pouring out. So it's helpful to kind of slow them down a little bit. So one of the questions would be, what will my benefit be? How much money will I get? And the answer, let's just talk about Social Security disability insurance, and as I'll explain in more detail when I start going through my slides, there's another program for people who don't qualify for Social Security disability, which is for people with a work history. But we'll talk about that later. So let's assume that she's going to qualify for SSDI, and she wants to know how much money she would get. And of course, I don't really know. I say, you can kind of figure if you were making about $50,000 a year and you're about 40 years old, maybe it's in the nature of $1,500 a month. Know that, and the only real way to find that out is to call Social Security and provide them with your Social Security number, other identifying information, and they can tell you what your primary insured amount is. In other words, what you would get on a monthly basis. And then you can get the number from Social Security's website. There's an 800 number on there. So then, so the questions again, can I apply before I quit? Before I stop working? No. Then how much would I get? Well, you have to call Social Security to find out. It basically depends on how much you paid into the system. What's the probability of success? Well, this is the hardest question of all, and I think the answer is, well, it depends on on someone's situation. Let's say Anne, in my example, has mostly invisible symptoms. In other words, fatigue, cognitive problems, depression, and maybe bowel and bladder problems. Well, then I'd be concerned, because I'm not sure in her case that the medical record is going to show enough disability for Social Security to allow her a claim or to find her disabled. And we'll talk about that a lot. I think that's the main issue for people with MS, is what about invisible symptoms and how do you communicate that to Social Security? But in general, the answer to her question, I'm kind of dancing around it, is it's about 30% probability that your claim would be allowed or that you'd be entitled to disability benefits right away. So again, back to Anne, who's depending on her paycheck, pay her mortgage, to eat, and for health care insurance, she finds out that there's not only is there uncertainty, it's actually maybe even a probability that she might be denied depending on her specific symptoms. So of course, it's a very discouraging story so far. I don't mean it to be. I think I have some more encouraging news as we go through this, but I just want to sort of get people's attention about how important this is to people and what some of the problems are. So another question is, she would like to know, well, okay, then if all of this goes well, when do I get my first check from Social Security? And then I have to explain that there's a 5-month exclusion. So you're not entitled to any money until the 6th month, which creates yet another problem for some people who are applying for Social Security disability benefits. When will I find out? Will be your next question, maybe. And I think the answer to that could be, it depends, but let's say approximately 3 to 5 months. It's a long, it takes a long time for Social Security to evaluate someone's claim. So, and then I guess another general question would be, well, what happens if I'm not disabled? If I'm not found disabled with my initial application, what then? And the answer is, well, then you appeal, okay. Well, how long does that take? Well, it takes about a year, and it's a very stressful time, okay. And then what about health insurance? Well, if you are found disabled, then you will be entitled to Medicare 2 years after you're entitled to your first check. Remember, the 5-month waiting period. So it's really more like 30 months before someone's entitled to Medicare. So that's the overview of the talk here. So I'm going to kind of get into my slides. I mean, this is what it's like to deal with a person who's going through that process. These are the sort of their anxieties. And I think that one of the services that I can provide in this situation is to sort of coach everyone through what the problem is, what the problems are. And I guess I see two main problems. The first problem is, as I sometimes say, Social Security doesn't care if people are disabled. They care if there's objective evidence of disability in the medical record. So is there objective evidence, and what is objective evidence of cognitive problems, for example, or fatigue? And then the second issue I think that comes up, and I can I think sometimes bridge the gap between the clinicians and their patients and Social Security, is to explain that what Social Security wants is not necessarily symptoms. Well, they do want symptoms, meaning what people experience. And those are again, the invisible symptoms, fatigue, and cognitive problems. But there's a gap then, because there's the so what part. So you're fatigued, so what does that matter for the workplace? What are the functional implications of your symptoms for your ability to work? So again, with that very long sort of pre-talk, let me start with some of my slides now, okay? So these are some of the things we're going to talk about now a little bit more slowly. Okay, what is SSDI and what is SSI? So the Social Security Disability Insurance, and SSI, that's Supplemental Security Income. Seems like there should be different letters to make them a little different. They sort of look the same, and I think that just adds to some confusion. So briefly, and again, more detail later, but SSDI is insurance for workers who've paid into the system. SSI, and who are disabled. SSI is welfare for people who are disabled and who don't have significant or practically any income or assets. So for people who are indigent and disabled, then SSI, and don't have a work history, then usually SSI is their best option. So what is it that's required to become insured through Social Security Disability Insurance? That's going to be how much somebody has paid in, and of course there are specific rules about that. People have to have earned a certain number of credits per year to be eligible to apply for SSDI, and some of them have to be earned recently. Again, sort of the specifics to follow. So what are the, whoops, excuse me, kind of can't see my screen. What is the SSDI benefit? We already kind of talked about it. How long does it take to get Medicare? We already talked about that too. It's about 30 months from when from your date of disability. What is the SSI benefit? We'll talk about that too. And how long does it take to get Medicaid? And the answer to that question is it's immediate, unlike Medicare, which is a 30-month delay. So in some respects, Medicaid, which goes along with the welfare benefit, is advantageous. So what's the probability that someone will prove their disability claim at different stages? How long does it take to get a decision from Social Security? What's the definition of disability? And then critically, I think, what can be done to make a claim more likely to succeed? So let's start with SSDI. What is Social Security Disability Insurance? So it's analogous to other kinds of insurance. So you have disability insurance if you're no longer able to earn a living, if you've been paying Social Security premiums, or as they're known, taxes. So for workers who have worked long enough and recently enough who become disabled, they are entitled to Social Security disability benefits, which will provide an income stream to partially at least replace the income they were getting from work, and at least at some point medical insurance through Medicare, which many people also get through work. So again, to replace some of the benefits of working when people are no longer able to do so. So what is the required work history for SSDI? So you need to have earned the proper number of credits. And it varies by age, but one way to think about it is the so-called 20-40 rule, which refers to the number of quarters. So I think it's kind of awkward to think about it in terms of quarters. So if you divide by 4, in both cases, you'll see it's 5 divided by 10. So you need to have worked approximately 5 in the last 10 years. That's the recency requirement for Social Security disability benefits. And again, sort of if you think about the analogy being other kinds of insurance, let's say medical insurance, if you're paying your premiums and something happens, and requiring you to get medical care, then your insurer will pay for that so long as your premiums are being paid. Right? So that's the way insurance works. And again, with Social Security disability insurance, it's analogous to that, but much more forgiving. So if you have a certain amount of time to apply for disability benefits, even though, and it's approximately 5 years, even though you're not paying into the system. And then, of course, because for younger people, different rules apply, because it would be, as you would see, that it's not reasonable in most cases to expect that a 19-year-old would have worked for the previous 5 years, for example. So Social Security set up special rules for younger people in terms of the number of credits they need to have earned to be eligible to apply. And that's just, again, eligibility. Then you still have to prove disability, which is usually what is the challenge for most people. But this comes up from time to time too, and we'll talk about some examples. Social Security disability also pays benefits for family members, and I've got that listed here. Most of probably the most common example of that is children. So people are entitled to a certain amount of money if they become disabled on their own account, and then if they have children, the benefit increases. And there are some other special situations in here too. You can see, I think there's one that comes up with surprising frequency is widows who are disabled at age 50. It's easy to miss that if you don't know about it. Of course, it's Social Security's job to help you figure that out. If you call them, they will. It's a very technical requirement. Then it's also similar rules for people who are divorced and over 50 and who are disabled. So here's what I was talking about before in graphic form. So how much income is replaced by Social Security. This is a slightly old slide. It was the best one I could find from 2007. And you can see that for people who earned relatively less money and paid relatively less in Social Security taxes, the amount of income that Social Security replaces if someone becomes disabled is actually pretty high. 60% of their salary is replaced by Social Security, and with family benefits, if they have children, for example, or in some of those other special situations, it can be as high as 80%. And for people who, you can see at the other end of the scale, high earners, and if they become disabled, then Social Security will replace much less of their income. But again, counting family members, it can be even there pretty high, over 40%. So again, Anne was asking in my hypothetical how much money she was likely to get. Well, of course, if you really need to know, Social Security used to send out a piece of paper on everyone's birthday explaining what they would get if they became disabled. I don't think they do that anymore. This is just a very, very rough guide to give people an idea. And if you're actively in the process, then I don't think there's really any substitute for calling Social Security and asking for your primary insured amount, the amount that you would be getting on a monthly basis if you're found disabled. And you can see here that the amount goes up pretty quickly from people making $25,000 a year, $50,000 a year, and then the difference between $100,000 and $300,000 is much less. So sort of the increased amount that people get at higher incomes is not as dramatic as it is in the people at the lower and to the middle income brackets. Okay, now moving on to SSI. Again, it's confusing because 3 of the letters are the same. So that's another program administered by the Social Security Administration. You could say, well, what if I don't have enough credits, or sometimes called quarters, to be eligible for Social Security disability benefits? Well, here's the other program. It's supplemental security income, and again, it's welfare. So for people who have no income and no assets, essentially, then and they can prove they're disabled, they would get a certain amount of money per month too. It's generally much less, sort of on the order of $720 per month. But critically, people who are awarded SSI benefits get Medicaid right away, which can be life-saving. So here's the actual number: is $700 a month is what SSI pays this year, and that changes every year. And then what about medical insurance? Well, we already talked about this again. We already talked about this earlier, rather. But people who get SSDI benefits are entitled to Medicare 2 years after Social Security begins payments to them. So remember, there's a 5-month exclusion. So 2 years and 5 months, it's really approximately 30 months before Medicare kicks in once somebody stops working. So it's a little confusing. The earliest, so Social Security not only has to find whether somebody is disabled, but they also have to find a disability date. And that's a challenge. It's sort of built on, and I'm not saying there's a better or different way to do it, but it's sort of built on the model of a car crash. In other words, somebody's fine one day and they're not the next day. And of course with MS, that's not the way it works. People have increasing difficulty with work and they don't become disabled on a particular date. At least most people don't have function that changes that dramatically permanently over a very short period of time, that is people with MS. But as a practical matter, the disability date can be as early as, and this is if all goes really well, the date somebody stops working. So that would become their disability date, because as you'll see, if you're earning more than, it's a little bit more than $1,000 a month, you're not disabled by definition. And there's sort of a cruel logic to that. If you're earning $1,000 a month, then you're capable of work, so you're not disabled. So, if somebody's fortunate, and again, all goes like a perfectly executed shuttle launch, they'll apply after they stop working, and their disability date will begin, for Social Security's purposes, the date they stopped working. They'd be entitled to their first check 6 months after that, and then Medicare 24 months after that. And so people will very frequently say, well, what are we supposed to do in the interim prior to when Medicare begins? And the answer, again, it's not a great answer, but the answer is people are expected to get COBRA benefits. And COBRA benefits, people can continue the benefits they were getting through work, last for 18 months. And then if Social Security finds somebody disabled within 3 months of when they stopped working, then it's extended for another 12 months, which is 30 months, which is approximately how long it takes for Medicare to begin. So putting aside how outrageously expensive COBRA premiums can be, the expectation, I think, is, which is why the Medicare doesn't kick in for 30 months, is that people can pay their COBRA benefits on their own for 30 months. Medicaid, in contrast, is associated with supplemental security income, the welfare benefit, and it begins right away. So let's just do a little case example. So let's take a 45-year-old woman who has MS and severely limited strength in her lower extremities who uses a wheelchair. She was, let's assume further, she was a flight attendant for 10 years before she quit work at age 35 to have children. She's not worked outside of the home for 10 years. Now she's divorced and unable to work. So what are the potential problems here, and what might be the potential solution? So the problem is almost certainly she will meet Social Security's standard for disability, being in a wheelchair. The question is she eligible for SSDI benefits? And well, she's paid into the system for 10 years, but it's been more than 5 years, so she's probably not eligible to apply for Social Security disability benefits based on current disability. So what might come up would be, again, if she's indigent, is that she might be eligible for SSI because, again, she's disabled, and if she has no significant assets, that might be the better solution. And the trick is, in this case, that, or not the trick, but one of the sort of challenges to looking at a case like this is to understand that there is a possibility that she would be eligible at age 50 to apply for SSDI benefits as through her ex-husband's number, Social Security number. So she's not applying based on her own work history, but on her ex-husband. Again, very specific rules apply in that situation. So, and we just reviewed this. She'd probably not be eligible for SSDI, but she might be eligible for SSI if she was indigent. So one way to check this is if somebody's concerned that they don't have a recent enough work history. And obviously you don't just say, oh gosh, it's been more than 5 years, I can't apply for Social Security. You have to call Social Security because of how much is at stake and find out when your date of last insurance was. Social Security will tell you the date by which you have to have evidence of disability. So perhaps it was 2 years ago that your insurance, let's say, lapsed through Social Security. Your date of last insurance was 2 years ago. And that doesn't necessarily mean you can't prove disability for purposes of Social Security. It means you have to prove that you were disabled prior to that date of last insurance. It's challenging to do. It's much better to apply before the insurance has lapsed, and sometimes people's date of last insurance can be in the future. So if you have you used to work and wonder if you might be eligible for SSDI, you need to call and find out when your date of last insurance hopefully will be. Hopefully it's still in the future. Or if it was in the past, you still need to know that one was my date of last insurance. Okay, so why don't we take a little bit of a break here and find out a little bit about the audience and see how many people have applied for Social Security disability benefits. Okay, so it looks like most of the people here have already applied for Social Security benefits. We can see it here. I think we have another question too. And this is just referring, for people who for many people who won't understand what an appeal is if you haven't gone through it, but for let's see, what percentage of people were denied with their initial application? So it looks like about 40% of our group, maybe 35, whoops, it's going down. This is pretty interesting. I mean, this is very similar to some of the data that I have. So it looks like about 35% in our group received disability benefits with their initial application. And then let's take another look here. If you were denied benefits, have you appealed your denial? so that's also interesting to me, that 60% of people who thought they were disabled applied for Social Security benefits, were told they weren't, and then didn't appeal. And well, we'll see some more information about that. Whoops. Okay, so there's one more question. How about for people who went through the appeal process? What percentage were successful there? So 60% were unsuccessful with their appeal. It's very striking to me how that's going to, all of that is going to match some data I'm going to show next. If you were awarded disability benefits, were you using an assistive device that's a cane, a walker, or a wheelchair, generally, not just at the hearing, but generally at the time of the hearing, were you using some kind of assistive device? Okay. So I have reasons for asking these questions, as you'll see soon. Okay. This is a busy slide, but it teaches a lot about Social Security. And I think what we're seeing with our group matches the data that we just collected from the group. So this is something I got from Social Security's website. I don't think it's up anymore, and it's a little bit old, from 2005. And so the numbers have changed a little, but honestly, they've gotten a little worse. So what this shows is that for people who make an initial application, sort of, that's the first bar. So people stop working, let's say it's usually, 4 months before getting this in the mail back saying whether they have been found disabled or not. Only in this slide, 35%. This is national data without respect to disease. But our own data that we just collected wasn't very different from this. And I know that in the region where I live, it's actually I think it's 5-state region, includes Colorado. Even people who have applied with neurological diagnoses, so for example, stroke, Parkinson's, seizures, MS, the success rate with the initial application is approximately 30%. So despite what you may read in the paper, it is not easy to get Social Security disability benefits. So from there, and this is also, again, sort of similar to what we saw, is look at the number of people who appeal. It's like a large percentage of people never followed up on their appeal. And I'm very concerned about that. I mean, I sometimes wonder whether those aren't the most disabled people of all, because they're not sort of able to manage the bureaucracy. There are probably other reasons too. But the first step in many regions, not in Colorado, there is no reconsideration in our region, but in other states there's a reconsideration. You can ask Social Security to reconsider their decision, and you can see that a few percentage of the applicants are successful at that point, but it's really a pretty small number, and so that's why Social Security said that's not cost effective. The amount of money that goes into that isn't worth the small percentage of cases that they find that should have been allowed in the first place. And so that's a matter of months, usually, from the initial claim, and then it goes from there to the hearing level, and that's ODAR, the Office of Disability Assessment Review, and that's where people will present before an administrative law judge. And you can see that in this case, sort of, it's more than half, 60% are successful at that level. And then from there, there's one more administrative review. Again, it's unclear why more people don't appeal this. And then from there, it goes into federal court, and then gets more complicated, but most people don't take it that far, and sometimes it's better to reapply rather than to take it to federal court. So anyway, I think that's a great review of sort of the process and the probability of success. We already talked about this. There's how long does it take to get benefits? So assuming, again, everything goes like a perfectly executed shuttle launch, somebody stops working, let's say, the beginning of 1 month, and 3 months later they get, or 4 months later, they get something in the mail saying that they've been found disabled, and they'll get their first check in about 2 months. That's the best case scenario for SSDI. And again, it's sort of Social Security has to pick a date of disability, which in real life is kind of a fiction, but as a legal matter, it sort of makes sense. It's, again, in the perfectly executed shuttle launch situation, it's the day somebody stops working. Because if you're earning, if you're making a certain amount of money, I think it's more than that. It's out of date, but it changes every year. It's a little more than that. I think it might be 1,060 now. But anyway, then you're by definition not disabled. And we already talked about how long it takes to appeal an unfavorable decision from Disability Determination Services. That's the state agency that contracts with the federal government in each state to make these medical decisions. So once Social Security has sent their file to DDS, Disability Determination Services, it comes back, Social Security will send someone a letter. Let's say it's unfavorable, then it can take 12 or worse months to have that decision reconsidered by an administrative law judge. So let's put some of these pieces together here. That is, what is the definition of disability? So you're not earning money. You're not earning more than $1,040 a month. I think it's also helpful to understand that Social Security says that it has the most demanding disability standard in the world. So let's go back to Anne in the first example, and let's assume Anne, just sort of a unlikely scenario maybe, but Anne, let's assume she was a roofer and she developed some balance problems. I don't think anyone in their right mind would say that Anne can continue to be a roofer. That doesn't necessarily mean that she's disabled. Social Security would expect to know why she couldn't go out and work as a greeter at Target, and that might be a terrible example. That might be one of the hardest jobs, but went out a dental office receptionist or some other sedentary work. So we understand that you can't balance on a roof, but we don't understand why you can't do sedentary work. So it's not able to do any job, not just the job you used to do. So then the question is, do you meet a listing? So Social Security will want to know whether you meet a listing, and that's sort of like I usually think of it as two ways to prove that you're disabled, and one is to meet a listing, and I'll show the MS listings in the next slide. But all is not lost. If people don't meet a listing, then they can still show that their residual functional capacity, that's what Social Security will evaluate, the residual capacity is inconsistent with working full-time, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And this could potentially come up in MS. The disability has to be expected to last for more than 12 months. So if somebody has an exacerbation, they could maybe transiently meet a listing. Again, listing I'll show in the next slide. But with steroids, hopefully, they would get better and their disability wouldn't last for 12 months. I'm going to skip that slide. This is their sort of sequential analysis here, and we already talked about it, but they're going to ask if you're working, and it's defined by the amount of money that you're making. And for people who have severe vision problems, working is defined at a higher level than for the rest of the claimants. And then the next question is, do you meet a listing? And again, that's, I think, the next slide. I know I keep saying that. And then Social Security want to know if you can do the work that you used to do. Again, this is the roofer. If you can't do that, then they go on to the next question. And given your age, education, and training, can you do other work that exists in the national economy? And Social Security is likely to look for objective evidence in your medical record. I sometimes, again, say Social Security doesn't care if you're disabled. They care if there's evidence of disability in your medical record. So how will Social Security find the listings that are relevant? There's something called the Blue Book that you can find online. It's also called the Adult Listings, and it's organized by body system. So there's endocrine, there's neurology, musculoskeletal, psychiatric, and other body symptoms, of course. I don't think even I can read this here on my computer. There's one for neurology, and if you click on the one for neurology, you will see this. So if somebody has multiple sclerosis with disorganization of motor function, as described in 1104B, which says that interferes with gait and station, and I would encourage people who are in this process to look at the Blue Book, look for the listings, and see exactly what it says. And there's that sort of legalese, which is as defined in, it should be not 1.09, I don't know what happened to the other one. It's 11.09 is the multiple sclerosis listing. And it says disorganization of motor function is described in 1104B, and that's interfering with gait and or station, which is why I was asking about how many people were using an assistive device, because I think that people who, especially people in a wheelchair, and with good evidence that they had that much lower extremity weakness should frankly sail through the process of Social Security. Their disability should be obvious to Social Security that they meet a listing, and that's the listing I think that they meet. So I think that there's at each stage of the hearing, actually with the initial determination, I think that most people who apply with some kind of assistive device should probably have an easier time of it, even though you can probably very quickly imagine a scenario where using a wheelchair or having lower extremity weakness isn't as disabling in the sense of interfering with work as having, let's say, severe cognitive problems and being able to walk just fine. Even so, and again, it would be a little unusual, but certainly can happen. Someone can be dependent upon a wheelchair and have no cognitive problems and no fatigue, or very little fatigue, and they might be pretty well suited to the workplace. Even so, their Social Security application, I'm not saying, obviously that creates a lot of problems, but in some ways that person might be better suited to the workplace than someone with cognitive problems. And again, by the way Social Security is going to analyze this, it may be easier for the person who's in a wheelchair because they have objective evidence of lower extremity weakness to meet the Social Security's definition of disability. So you can see there's some other listings here. Severe vision problems, you can look up in the Blue Book exactly. I think the listing for vision problems is that the visual acuity in the better eye is less than 2200. So certainly not, optic neuritis in one eye is usually not going to do it. It has to be real blindness. And then this one is, I don't think anyone really knows what to do. Nobody really knows what to do with this letter C, significant reproducible fatigue of motor function with substantial weakness on repetitive activity. To my way of thinking, that having some experience in the clinic, is that doesn't really happen at the neurologist's office. They don't do repetitive testing. So to see if you fatigue, I always think maybe somebody who would be able to walk up the stairs once. If you ask them to walk up the stairs 3 or 4 times, you'd see very quickly that they wouldn't be able to do it, and that would be characteristic, really, for MS-related fatigue. But a lot of times that kind of evidence is not going to be in somebody's chart. So the brief muscle testing that occurs in the neurology visit, I don't think really can get at this. So the question is, well, how would you prove it? So for, again, people with severe motor function deficits and who are using an assistive device, I think their application should be pretty straightforward. I was surprised to see the number of people who were using assisted devices still at the hearing level being denied. But one thing that can be very helpful, I think, is to get a letter of support from a physician. And there are no magic kind of letters here. This is the kind of thing that it's, I think, would make someone's application much more likely to succeed. If the physician or other clinicians, it's preferably a physician, would write a letter explaining the so what. So this person has fatigue. So what? How would that interfere with work? Well, it would interfere with work because that person would need to take breaks every so often throughout the day, and that this is characteristic for MS, or let's say cognitive problems, sort of the so what, so that they wouldn't be able to learn complex tasks or even follow simple instructions. If that's the case, that would be a pretty severe level of cognitive problems. So I think it's sometimes helpful for physicians to chart impairments. I think it's even reasonable for people who are going through the process to say, well, depending on the stage, hey, I'm having more and more trouble with work, for example, and that my fatigue or the hot days are making it so that my productivity is going down. And I think to create that longitudinal sort of over time history of fatigue interfering with work would be more persuasive to Social Security certainly than just the claimant himself or herself saying it. There should be medical evidence to back up what the claimant is saying. So I don't know, I guess my point with this is that I sometimes think that to have a physical therapist or an occupational therapist do a functional capacities evaluation to measure, they spend enough time with someone to know that they have fatigability of motor function over time, or that fatigue would interfere with work in specific ways. And the functional capacities evaluation wants to know how much somebody can sit or stand or walk or carry, and not only that, but how much they would be able to do it throughout the day. So up to 33% of the time, up to 66% of the time. And I think it's a lot to ask your neurologist to chart that. Mostly they don't know that. I mean, they can say what you say mostly, or they can, I think it's not inappropriate for them to fill out forms that ask those questions, but I think, in my opinion, I speak only for myself, I think it's stronger when it's done by, say, a physical therapist or an occupational therapist actually tested, and then the physician is in a position to review that and agree with those findings. I think that's a persuasive approach, and I think it's an honest approach, too, rather than to have the neurologist speculate. Another critical tool for a lot of people is to get neuropsychological testing. So to have cognitive function measured, and very few people with MS will have the degree of cognitive function alone that meets a listing, but it's the way all of the symptoms interact, so that people have some, let's say, mild trouble remembering, and that coupled with their fatigue and the frequency with which they need to use the men's room would cause them to be off task in the workplace a certain amount of time, for example. So it might be part of the totality of circumstances affecting the residual functional capacity that makes somebody unable to work. I just have a few more samples there. So this is, I think you can kind of find this out there. Social Security has a form that asks about how much somebody can sit and stand and lift and carry. There are specific exertional functions, and they will try to define whether somebody, how impaired they are. Will they be able to do it frequently, like lift 10 pounds frequently throughout the day, or occasionally, or never? And these are the kinds of functions that will determine whether there are any jobs that exist in the economy that somebody can do. Let's say they don't meet a listing. So then it's the residual functional capacity that will be relevant. And I'm kind of running towards the end of my hour here, so I'm going to just speed up, and I'm very near the end of my slides too. But I think it's important to note that there is a pecking order for Social Security's purposes, and here are the people who are at the top of the list. Certainly, treating physicians carry the most weight. Psychologists and neuropsychologists are psychologists, optometrists, podiatrists, speech-language pathologists are also acceptable medical sources. And of course, I'm a physician assistant, and that puts me on this other sources of evidence. So less persuasive with Social Security, but I think Social Security will usually factor, and maybe heavily, the functional limitations described by the physician assistant or nurse practitioner, so long as they're well backed up in the chart, in the medical record, that is. So how would somebody begin the process? You just call, I think, the Social Security field office. You can look online, and you can find there's a little box that says locate office search or something like that, I think, and you put in your zip code and you can find a local office, or there's the main phone number. And then I do some free consultations individually on the phone, and so I'm trying, I don't know if there are 140 people here. I don't know if I could do all of those in short order, but if I'd certainly be privileged to do what I can. So there's my legal assistance phone number there. And again, this is a project that's supported through the Rocky Mountain MS Center. So I think that's it for what I'm going to present today, and that leaves a few minutes for questions, and I'd like to turn it over to maybe Anne or to help with question selections.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you so much, Tom. There's so much information here for us to all just soak in. Steve, quite a few questions, and if you do have more, please feel free to chat them in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Okay, so one of our questions is about self-employment. How do you know if you've paid the SSDI premiums? If you are self-employed, you pay Social Security tax, but does that include the SSDI?
Yeah, that's what Social Security taxes go to. So Social Security retirement and Social Security disability. So if you're paying Social Security taxes, then, and again, there's the recency stuff we talked about. So if you've paid long enough and recently enough, then you will likely be, then self-employed people will likely be insured too. But there's really no substitute for calling Social Security and asking. They're usually excellent, by the way. The people, you have to wait in line for 20 or 30 minutes, but the people you talk to are usually really good. And if you can get through and say, the technical way to ask it is, what is my date of last insurance? And they'll say you have 4 years or something like that in the future. Well, do I have enough credits to apply currently? It's the same question, yes. And then again, while you're there, I don't think it would matter hugely because, even if it's $100 or $2,000, you'd probably want it, but you might want to also ask how much money it would be too.
Great. Another question. I was awarded a Social Security disability on my first application. Can this benefit be taken away from me in the future?
Yes. So and I think the biggest risk of that is related to work. So for people who return to work, I mean, it is critical that you notify Social Security of any income that you get related to work. And if you do, then you after you earn a certain amount of money, and I'm sorry, it escapes me the exact amount. It's about $740, I think, but you can't rely on that. You have to double check. And it could start a return to work cycle. There's a whole program, the return to work program, and there are very technical rules for that. But at some point, you stop getting Social Security benefits if you're working. If you're working and earning a certain amount of money.
Okay. And then we have a question about education. If you have a 4-year college degree and you no longer are able to work in your professional field, might you be assigned to be a target greeter even if you have a higher education? Hold on, let me read this again. If you have a 4-year college,
I think I understand the question. So it's not. Yes. So you might be. I listed education as a factor to be considered, but in a way, sort of higher education works against somebody in their application. So it's not that you have a college degree, we don't expect you to do that. If you do need to be able to, if there's other work that you can do, then you're supposed to do it.
Okay,
and one college degree is not required.
Great, and one final question. If I work part-time but make less than $1,000 a month, does this mean that I'm not working and ineligible for benefits?
So if you're earning less than substantial gainful activity, that is, you're working part-time, or I think that's really the only way. I think minimum wage gets you over substantial gainful activity. So if someone's working part-time, yes, they can apply for Social Security disability benefits. Okay. I mean, obviously, Social Security still has to find them disabled, but that wouldn't preclude a finding of disability.
Okay, and I lied. There is one more question. Is an attorney recommended for initial filing or more useful after first denial?
Great question, and I almost, when I was looking at my talk, I was thinking I should have included something. So I'm going to I don't know the answer. It depends on the attorney, and depends on the clinician, and it depends on the claimant, right? So there's variable factors. There are some people who are very capable of filing a claim for themselves and negotiating with their physicians maybe or clinicians to see if they can get the support they need. And there are clinicians who are very willing to help. And so in some situations with the initial application, I think the answer may be no. I think it's also good to know how lawyers get paid in this process. So the standard Social Security approved fee agreement is 25% of retroactive benefits. So retroactive benefits, if somebody applies, everything goes really smoothly, and they find out in 4 months that they're going to get a check in 2 months, then there will be no retroactive benefits. So obviously the lawyer in that case is 25% of $0. The maximum is $6,000. So if there's an appeal, and there might be 14 months of retroactive benefits, it could be up to $6,000. Is probably usually less, but that's the maximum. I do think almost everybody should have a lawyer for their appeal. For the initial determination, there are too many variables. I don't know what I think about that. Okay. I guess, like I said, it depends on who's involved in their relationship with what clinician. Let me back up. Let me change my mind. I think there is some advantage in filling out the applications. That some experience that a good lawyer would bring to that process. So for most people at the initial determination level, kind of depending on your circumstances, when you started working, when the retroactive how much retroactive benefit there might be, it might be in their interest to have a lawyer even at the initial determination level to help set the onset date right. So if you're entitled to retroactive benefits, to make sure that all goes well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Tom. We have a lot of questions that have come in, but we've run out of time. I will be tracking these questions and have them saved, and possibly I can forward a few of them to Tom, and he can maybe answer them for me privately by email, and I can send those out to everyone later this week. But again, I wanted to thank you, Tom, so much for this presentation, a lot of helpful information that I also learned from. And I just wanted to thank all of you participants for joining us and for staying late on the call for those that are still on. Before I conclude, I did just want to share some more information and additional resources that we provide. We have an e-news archive, which is our monthly e-newsletter, and it features any upcoming events and programs that Can Do MS has going on, so you can look for that on our website. You can also submit any questions and answers on our online Q&A form. It's called Ask Can Do Team. That can also be found on our website, and you can submit any questions that you might have, and we will forward them to our team of MS experts. And we also have a Can Do library, which includes articles on all types of topics such as health, wellness, and lifestyle enhancement. And you can always refer to this resource for information that you might need. And as I mentioned in the beginning of our webinar, we do want to invite you to celebrate Can Do Day with us, which is on September 22nd. It is the birthday of our founder, Jimmy Huga. So please join us in honoring Jimmy and the Can Do spirit by participating in the Can Do Day Pledge. All you need to do is visit our website at the link below, or just search for us on Facebook and search for Can Do Multiple Sclerosis, and you can post your pledge of what you plan to do, whether it's just riding your bike or hiking or visiting with relatives and friends. And then on Can Do Day on September 22nd, you can post a picture of what you've done. We look forward to sharing this day with you and seeing what you've accomplished on Can Do Day. And our next webinar for October will be held on October 8th. It's at the same time at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And this webinar is solely dedicated to answering your questions. It is a live forum of questions and answers. And the presenters for that evening are Julianne Hansen-Zlatev, who is an occupational therapist, Deb Miller, who's a psychologist, and David Jones, a physician. So you can join us from the convenience of your home or office at no charge to you. And for those participating live tonight, once this presentation is over, you'll see a survey pop up on your computer screen. And we'd very much appreciate if you can take a moment to complete the survey and share your input. Your feedback always helps us to improve on our webinars. And you'll also receive a copy of tonight's webinar slides by email. So thank you again so much, Tom, and thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great evening.